My name is Jessica Thompson, and at 28 years old, I thought landing a position at Hartwell Associates, one of downtown Chicago's most prestigious accounting firms, was the beginning of everything I'd worked for. The office occupied 3 floors of the Willis Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of Lake Michigan and the city skyline that looked like a postcard during those crisp October mornings. I remember my first day so clearly, walking through those polished marble lobbies in my best navy suit, feeling like I was finally stepping into the professional life I'd dreamed about since graduating from Northwestern with my accounting degree. The firm had a reputation that stretched back 40 years, built on the foundation of old-money Chicago families and corporate clients who valued tradition, discretion, and results. The partners' offices lined the 42nd floor, each one decorated with leather-bound books, mahogany furniture, and oil paintings that probably cost more than my annual salary. My cubicle was on the 39th floor, nestled among 24 other junior associates who all seemed to share the same ambitious energy and carefully pressed business attire that made us look like extras in a movie about corporate success. What I couldn't have known was that beneath the polished veneer of professional excellence, Hartwell Associates harbored secrets that would shatter my faith in justice, challenge everything I believed about truth and power, and ultimately force me to become a warrior in a battle I never wanted to fight. The man who would become my tormentor was already watching me from his corner office, planning a campaign of abuse that he thought his position and influence would protect him from facing consequences for. Marcus Hartwell Jr., my immediate supervisor and the founder's son, seemed like everything a mentor should be during those first few weeks. At 45, he was considered one of the rising stars in Chicago's financial district, known for his ability to land major corporate accounts and his talent for making clients feel like they were part of an exclusive club. His office was a shrine to success, awards covering one wall, photos with mayors and governors covering another, and a view of the Chicago River that he claimed inspired his best strategic thinking. During my first month, Marcus's attention felt like the kind of professional guidance that ambitious young accountants dream about receiving. He would stop by my cubicle to review my work, offering suggestions that invariably improved my performance and made me look competent in front of other partners. His feedback was always delivered with the patient tone of someone who genuinely wanted to see me succeed, and when he invited me to join client dinners at high-end restaurants in River North, I felt like I was being inducted into the inner circle of Chicago's business elite. But what I interpreted as exceptional mentorship was actually the calculated grooming behavior of a predator who had perfected his technique over years of targeting young women in vulnerable professional positions. The expensive dinners, the career advice, the professional opportunities, they were all part of a systematic approach designed to isolate me from my peers, make me dependent on his approval, and create situations where he could gradually escalate his inappropriate behavior while maintaining plausible deniability about his true intentions. The inappropriate behavior began so subtly that I questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was being overly sensitive or misinterpreting normal professional interactions. It started with comments about my appearance that were framed as career advice but carried undertones that made me uncomfortable, suggestions about hairstyles that would make me look more executive, or compliments about outfits that seemed to focus more on how they fit than on their appropriateness for client meetings. Then came the physical contact that crossed professional boundaries but was delivered with such casual confidence that challenging it felt like making a scene over nothing. His hand would linger too long on my shoulder when he leaned over to review my work, or he'd guide me through doorways with his palm pressed against my lower back in a way that felt more intimate than professional. Each incident was minor enough that complaining about it would have seemed ridiculous, but together they created a pattern of behavior that made me increasingly uncomfortable in his presence. The other junior associates began treating me differently, and I initially attributed their coolness to jealousy over the obvious favor I was receiving from one of the firm's most influential partners. Conversations would stop when I entered the break room, and invitations to after-work drinks became less frequent, leaving me increasingly isolated from people who should have been my natural allies. What I didn't understand was that they weren't jealous. They were worried, and some of them had probably seen this pattern before with other young women who had caught Marcus's attention. February 14th, Valentine's Day, would forever be etched in my memory as the night when my professional dream transformed into a living nightmare. Marcus had invited me to work late on what he described as a critical presentation for a potential client worth over $10 million in annual revenue to the firm. The office was nearly empty by 7 p.m., with only security guards and a few dedicated workaholics remaining in the building that usually buzzed with hundreds of employees during normal business hours. We worked in his corner office, surrounded by documents and charts that covered every surface like evidence in a detective's investigation. Around 9 p.m., Marcus ordered dinner from an upscale restaurant and opened a bottle of expensive wine that he claimed was necessary for creative thinking about the presentation's strategic elements. The wine was good, the work was demanding, and his reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted a glass despite my usual policy of avoiding alcohol in professional settings. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a disaster that you can see coming but can't prevent. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed, Marcus's behavior shifted from professionally friendly to personally invasive. His comments became increasingly inappropriate, his physical proximity more threatening, and when I tried to redirect our focus back to work, he made it clear that my professional future at the firm depended on my willingness to accept his advances. The assault was brief but devastating, a violation that shattered not just my physical boundaries but my entire understanding of workplace safety and professional relationships. Afterward, Marcus straightened his tie and returned to discussing financial projections as if nothing had occurred, the disconnect between his casual demeanor and the gravity of what had just transpired making me question my own perception of reality. The days following the assault passed in a haze of confusion, shame, and desperate attempts to convince myself that what had happened wasn't as serious as it felt. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, hoping that professional success might somehow erase the memory of that terrible night and restore my sense of control over my career and my life. Marcus continued to behave as if nothing had changed, offering the same professional guidance and career opportunities that had initially made me feel so grateful for his mentorship. But the assault had fundamentally altered the power dynamic between us in ways that made every interaction feel threatening and manipulative. When he praised my work, I wondered what he expected in return. When he invited me to client meetings, I questioned whether my professional value was based on my accounting skills or my willingness to remain silent about his behavior. The job that had once felt like the fulfillment of my career ambitions now felt like a trap that I couldn't escape without destroying everything I'd worked to achieve. I found myself facing an impossible choice that countless women in similar situations have confronted throughout history: remain silent and continue to endure abuse while maintaining my career, or speak up and risk being labeled as a troublemaker who couldn't handle the realities of corporate life. The statistics about workplace sexual assault were terrifying. Most cases went unreported, and when women did come forward, they were more likely to face retaliation than to see their attackers held accountable. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the situation. I couldn't confide in my colleagues without risking my professional reputation, and I couldn't discuss the situation with friends or family without admitting that my dream job had become a nightmare that I felt powerless to escape. Every day felt like walking through a minefield where any wrong step could explode my carefully constructed professional life. 3 weeks after the first assault, Marcus made it clear that my silence had been interpreted as consent rather than trauma-induced paralysis. He scheduled another late-night work session, this time under the pretense of preparing for a major audit that required immediate attention. Despite every instinct screaming at me to refuse, I felt trapped by the same professional obligations and career fears that had led me into the first dangerous situation. This time, there was no pretense of work-related necessity or alcohol-fueled miscommunication. Marcus's behavior was deliberate, calculated, and designed to reinforce his power over my professional future while satisfying his own twisted desires. The assault was more violent than the first, leaving me with bruises that I had to carefully conceal with makeup and clothing choices that wouldn't raise questions from colleagues who might notice physical evidence of abuse. The aftermath was different this time. Instead of confusion and self-doubt, I felt a burning rage that cut through the fear and shame that had paralyzed me after the first attack. The realization that Marcus viewed me as nothing more than a disposable object for his gratification, that he felt entitled to use his position to victimize women who depended on him for their professional survival, ignited a fury that gave me the courage to consider fighting back despite the overwhelming odds against me. That night, sitting in my small apartment overlooking Lincoln Park, I made the decision that would define the rest of my story. I was going to report Marcus Hartwell Jr. for sexual assault, regardless of the consequences for my career or my reputation. I knew the odds were against me, that powerful men like Marcus rarely faced meaningful consequences for their actions, but I also knew that remaining silent would only enable him to victimize other women who trusted him with their professional futures. The next morning, I walked into the offices of the Chicago Police Department's Special Victims Unit with a determination that masked the terror I felt about challenging one of the city's most influential business leaders. The detective assigned to my case was a woman named Sarah Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had heard countless stories like mine and whose expression suggested she'd seen too many cases where powerful men escaped consequences for their crimes. Detective Rodriguez listened to my account with professional detachment, taking notes and asking questions that felt both necessary and invasive. She explained the challenges of prosecuting sexual assault cases involving powerful defendants, the difficulty of proving crimes that typically occurred without witnesses, and the likelihood that Marcus's legal team would attempt to destroy my credibility through character assassination and victim-blaming tactics that had proven effective in countless similar cases. The interview process was exhausting and humiliating, requiring me to relive the most traumatic experiences of my life in clinical detail while knowing that every word would be scrutinized and potentially used against me if the case went to trial. Detective Rodriguez was kind but realistic about the challenges ahead, explaining that sexual assault cases involving prominent figures often became public spectacles where the victim's entire life was subjected to invasive examination while the perpetrator's wealth and influence provided protection from meaningful consequences. When I left the police station that afternoon, I felt simultaneously empowered by having taken action and terrified about what would come next. The wheels of justice moved slowly, and in the meantime, I had to continue working alongside my attacker, pretending that nothing had changed while knowing that my professional future hung in the balance of a legal system that historically favored men like Marcus over women like me. Within 48 hours of filing my police report, it became clear that Marcus had been informed about the investigation and had begun implementing a sophisticated damage control strategy designed to discredit my allegations while protecting his reputation and position within the firm. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a meeting with Human Resources, where I was informed that several colleagues had expressed concerns about my attitude and performance in recent weeks. The HR representative, a woman named Patricia Walsh who had worked at Hartwell Associates for over 15 years, delivered the criticism with the practiced efficiency of someone who had participated in similar character assassination campaigns before. According to Patricia, my work quality had declined, my interactions with colleagues had become confrontational, and several clients had expressed dissatisfaction with my performance on recent projects. None of these allegations were substantiated with specific examples or documentation, but they created a paper trail that could be used to justify my termination if necessary. What made the meeting particularly disturbing was the subtle threat underlying Patricia's professional demeanor. She suggested that I might benefit from counseling to help me manage the stress of working in a high-pressure environment, and she recommended that I consider whether Hartwell Associates was truly the right fit for someone with my personality type. The message was clear: withdraw my allegations against Marcus, or face the systematic destruction of my professional reputation through a campaign of manufactured complaints and performance issues. The retaliation extended beyond formal HR actions to include social isolation and professional sabotage that made it increasingly difficult to perform my job effectively. Colleagues who had previously been friendly began avoiding me, meetings were scheduled without including me, and critical information was withheld in ways that set me up to fail on important projects. The message was unmistakable: challenge Marcus Hartwell Jr. and the entire organization would unite to destroy you. As word of my allegations spread through the Chicago business community, I discovered that being labeled as crazy was far more damaging to my professional and personal life than the actual sexual assaults had been. The whisper campaign against me was sophisticated and systematic, designed to undermine my credibility while providing Marcus's supporters with plausible deniability about their role in character assassination. Former colleagues began describing me as unstable, attention-seeking, and unable to handle the pressures of high-level business relationships. The narrative that emerged portrayed me as a delusional young woman who had misinterpreted normal professional interactions as sexual advances, someone whose mental health issues had led her to make false accusations against a respected business leader who had tried to help her career. The psychological impact of being labeled as mentally unstable was devastating in ways that the physical assaults hadn't been. The attacks on my body had been violations that I could eventually heal from, but the attacks on my credibility and sanity threatened to destroy my entire sense of self and my ability to trust my own perceptions of reality. When enough people suggest that you're crazy, you begin to question whether they might be right, whether your memories are accurate, whether your understanding of what happened can be trusted. The isolation was complete and suffocating. Friends began distancing themselves to avoid being associated with controversy. Family members questioned whether I was handling the situation appropriately, and potential employers in the Chicago business community viewed me as a liability who might bring unwanted attention and legal complications to their organizations. I had become radioactive, untouchable, a cautionary tale about what happened to women who challenged powerful men. Detective Rodriguez worked diligently on my case, but the investigation quickly ran into the predictable obstacles that protected powerful men like Marcus from facing consequences for their crimes. Without physical evidence or witnesses to the assaults, the case relied entirely on my testimony against Marcus's denials, and his legal team was already preparing a defense strategy that would portray me as a mentally unstable opportunist seeking attention and financial gain. The detective interviewed several of my former colleagues, but their responses had clearly been coordinated to present a consistent narrative about my alleged mental instability and poor performance. Witnesses who might have supported my claims about Marcus's inappropriate behavior suddenly developed selective amnesia, claiming they had never observed anything unusual in his interactions with female employees. The few people who might have been willing to corroborate my story were afraid of losing their jobs or facing the same retaliation that had already destroyed my career. Marcus's attorneys, a team from one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, launched a preemptive strike against my credibility by filing motions questioning my mental competency and suggesting that my allegations were the product of delusions rather than actual events. They demanded access to my medical and psychological records, claiming that my history would reveal a pattern of mental illness that explained my false memories of sexual assault. The legal system that was supposed to protect victims seemed designed to re-victimize women who dared to challenge powerful men. Every aspect of my life was subjected to invasive scrutiny while Marcus continued to work, travel, and maintain his position in Chicago's business community as if nothing had happened. The message was clear. The system would protect him and destroy me, just as it had protected countless other powerful predators throughout history. 6 months into the investigation, with no progress toward justice and my professional reputation in ruins, I reached a breaking point that nearly convinced me to withdraw my allegations and disappear from Chicago entirely. The constant stress of fighting a battle I seemed destined to lose had taken a devastating toll on my physical and mental health, leaving me struggling with anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms that made it difficult to function in daily life. My savings were nearly exhausted from legal fees and the inability to find stable employment in a city where my name had become synonymous with career suicide. The apartment overlooking Lincoln Park that had once felt like a symbol of my professional success now felt like a prison where I hid from a world that had labeled me as crazy and dangerous. Every day brought new humiliations and setbacks that reinforced the message that challenging powerful men was futile and self-destructive. The psychological warfare was relentless and sophisticated. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, mysterious packages delivered to my apartment, and social media harassment from fake accounts created an atmosphere of constant threat and intimidation. Marcus's supporters had turned character assassination into an art form, using methods that were difficult to trace but impossible to ignore. During my darkest moments, I understood why so many women chose to remain silent about sexual assault rather than endure the systematic destruction that came with speaking truth to power. The cost of seeking justice seemed disproportionate to any possible benefit, and the likelihood of success appeared so remote that continuing the fight felt like a form of masochism rather than courage. I came within hours of calling Detective Rodriguez to withdraw my complaint and accepting that Marcus Hartwell Jr. would never face consequences for his crimes. Just when I had decided to abandon my fight for justice, Detective Rodriguez received an anonymous phone call that would ultimately expose the truth and vindicate my allegations in ways I had never imagined possible. The caller, whose identity would remain a mystery throughout the subsequent investigation, provided specific information about the location of security cameras that had recorded Marcus's criminal behavior during both assaults. According to the anonymous tipster, Hartwell Associates maintained a sophisticated surveillance system that included hidden cameras in executive offices, designed ostensibly for security purposes but actually used to monitor employee behavior and gather intelligence that could be used for blackmail or leverage in business negotiations. The cameras had recorded both attacks in their entirety, providing irrefutable evidence of Marcus's guilt and my innocence. The revelation that video evidence existed was simultaneously vindicating and horrifying. On one hand, it meant that my allegations could finally be proven and that Marcus would face consequences for his crimes. On the other hand, it meant that the most traumatic experiences of my life had been recorded and would potentially be viewed by investigators, attorneys, and possibly jury members if the case went to trial. Detective Rodriguez immediately began the process of obtaining search warrants to seize the surveillance equipment and recordings from Hartwell and Associates. The legal proceedings were complicated by Marcus's attempts to claim attorney-client privilege and trade secret protections for the recordings, but ultimately the criminal nature of the evidence overcame his efforts to suppress it. The day Detective Rodriguez called to inform me that the surveillance footage had been recovered and reviewed was one of the most emotionally complex days of my life. After months of being labeled as crazy and delusional, having my memories and perceptions questioned by everyone from police investigators to former friends, the existence of video evidence felt like being rescued from drowning in a sea of gaslighting and victim blaming. The recordings were exactly as the anonymous tipster had described, clear, high-definition footage that captured both assaults from multiple angles, leaving no doubt about Marcus's guilt or my resistance to his attacks. The cameras had also recorded audio, preserving his threats about my career and his casual dismissal of my protests, providing evidence not just of sexual assault but of the power dynamics and manipulation that had made the crimes possible. Detective Rodriguez explained that the video evidence transformed the case from a difficult he-said-she-said situation into a straightforward criminal prosecution with overwhelming proof of guilt. Marcus's legal team could no longer claim that the encounters were consensual or that my allegations were the product of mental illness or false memories. The cameras had captured truth in ways that no amount of legal maneuvering or character assassination could overcome. The emotional impact of knowing that my worst experiences had been recorded was difficult to process. While the evidence vindicated my claims and proved my sanity, it also meant that my trauma had been preserved in digital form, available for viewing by anyone involved in the legal proceedings. The violation felt compounded by the knowledge that Marcus had potentially watched the recordings himself, reliving his crimes as a form of entertainment or power fantasy. Marcus Hartwell Jr.'s arrest on charges of sexual assault sent shockwaves through Chicago's business community and exposed the culture of impunity that had protected powerful men like him for generations. The arrest occurred at his office during a high-profile client meeting, with Detective Rodriguez and her team executing the warrant in full view of colleagues and clients who had previously dismissed my allegations as the fantasies of an unstable woman. The perp walk from Hartwell and Associates to the waiting police cars was broadcast on every local news channel, showing one of Chicago's most influential businessmen in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions about the charges and the evidence that had led to his arrest. The image of Marcus being led away in handcuffs became a symbol of accountability that many people had believed was impossible in a system designed to protect the wealthy and powerful. The initial charges included 2 counts of sexual assault. But as the investigation expanded with the credibility provided by the video evidence, additional victims began coming forward with similar stories about Marcus's predatory behavior. The pattern that emerged showed a systematic campaign of abuse spanning over a decade, with Marcus using his position and influence to target vulnerable young women who depended on him for their professional survival. The business community's response to the arrest revealed the depth of the culture that had enabled Marcus's crimes. Some colleagues and clients expressed shock and claimed they had never suspected his true nature, while others acknowledged that rumors about his inappropriate behavior had circulated for years but had been dismissed as gossip or acceptable quirks of a successful executive. The revelation that his crimes had been recorded exposed the willful blindness that had allowed a predator to operate with impunity in plain sight. The video evidence from my case opened floodgates that revealed the true scope of Marcus's criminal behavior and the systematic cover-up that had protected him throughout his career. Detective Rodriguez discovered that the surveillance system at Hartwell and Associates had been recording inappropriate behavior for years, creating an archive of evidence that documented not just Marcus's crimes but similar behavior from other senior executives in the firm. Additional victims began contacting the police after news of Marcus's arrest made it safe for them to come forward with their own stories of abuse and intimidation. These women, ranging in age from recent college graduates to experienced professionals, described a consistent pattern of predatory behavior that had been enabled and covered up by the firm's leadership. Their stories painted a picture of a toxic culture where sexual harassment was normalized and victims were systematically silenced through professional retaliation. The investigation expanded to include charges related to the cover-up itself, with several senior executives and HR personnel facing criminal charges for their role in suppressing complaints and retaliating against victims who had tried to report abuse. The criminal conspiracy extended beyond individual acts of violence to include organized efforts to obstruct justice and protect predators from facing consequences for their crimes. The Financial Crimes Unit also became involved when investigators discovered that Marcus had used firm resources to fund surveillance operations against his victims, hiring private investigators to gather compromising information that could be used for blackmail or character assassination. The same wealth and influence that had protected him from accountability had also funded sophisticated campaigns to destroy the lives of women who dared to challenge him. Marcus's trial became a media sensation that exposed not just his individual crimes but the entire culture of abuse and impunity that had flourished in Chicago's business community. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, victims' advocates, and members of the public who had been following the case as a symbol of long-overdue accountability for powerful men who had believed themselves above the law. The video evidence was devastating to Marcus's defense, providing irrefutable proof of his guilt that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome. His attorneys attempted to argue that the recordings had been obtained illegally and should be excluded from evidence, but their motions were denied by a judge who recognized the paramount importance of holding powerful predators accountable for their crimes. My testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, and taking the stand to confront Marcus directly was one of the most difficult but empowering experiences of my life. Looking him in the eye while describing his crimes in detail, knowing that the video evidence supported every word I spoke, felt like reclaiming power that he had stolen from me during those terrible nights in his office. The defense's strategy of portraying me as mentally unstable collapsed completely in the face of video evidence that proved my allegations were accurate in every detail. The character witnesses who had been prepared to testify about my alleged instability were forced to acknowledge that the recordings showed I had been telling the truth about crimes that they had dismissed as delusions or lies. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Marcus, including multiple counts of sexual assault, criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice, and witness intimidation. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity with which the video recordings established his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The moment the foreman read the guilty verdicts was emotional in ways I hadn't expected, representing not just legal victory but the restoration of my credibility and sanity after months of being labeled as crazy by people who had either been fooled by Marcus's deception or complicit in his cover-up. The validation of my experience felt like emerging from a nightmare where everyone had insisted that reality was different from what I had experienced and remembered. Marcus's reaction to the conviction was telling. Instead of showing remorse or accepting responsibility for his crimes, he maintained his innocence and blamed me for destroying his life, with what he continued to characterize as false allegations motivated by personal and professional jealousy. His inability to acknowledge the truth even when confronted with video evidence demonstrated the narcissistic entitlement that had enabled his predatory behavior for so many years. The other executives who had participated in the cover-up also faced criminal convictions, sending a message that enabling and protecting predators would result in serious legal consequences. The systematic nature of the conspiracy was exposed in detail, showing how institutional power had been used to silence victims and protect criminals from accountability. Marcus received a sentence of 15 years in prison, reflecting both the severity of his crimes and the aggravating factors related to his abuse of power and systematic efforts to destroy his victims' credibility. The judge's comments during sentencing addressed not just his individual crimes but the broader culture of impunity that had enabled his behavior and the importance of sending a clear message that wealth and influence would not protect predators from facing justice. The other defendants received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years in prison, depending on their level of involvement in the conspiracy and their cooperation with the investigation. The HR executive who had participated in retaliating against me received 3 years in prison, while several other executives received suspended sentences in exchange for their testimony about the culture of abuse at Hartwell Associates. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions resulted in settlements totaling over $50 million for the various victims, effectively bankrupting the firm and ensuring that the financial consequences of enabling abuse would be severe enough to deter other organizations from similar behavior. The money could never undo the trauma we had experienced, but it provided some measure of justice and the resources needed to rebuild our lives after the destruction caused by Marcus and his enablers. The professional licensing boards also took action against the executives involved in the cover-up, revoking or suspending their credentials and ensuring that they would not be able to use their positions to victimize other women in different organizations. The comprehensive nature of the accountability sent a clear message that the consequences of enabling abuse would extend far beyond criminal penalties to include the destruction of professional careers and reputations. The years following Marcus's conviction were a journey of healing and rebuilding that taught me as much about resilience and recovery as the trial had taught me about justice and accountability. The trauma of sexual assault and the subsequent campaign of character assassination had left deep wounds that required professional counseling and the support of other survivors who understood the unique challenges of overcoming both physical violation and psychological warfare. I eventually found work with a victims' rights organization, using my experience to help other women navigate the legal system and the emotional challenges of confronting powerful predators who seemed invincible until the moment they were exposed and held accountable. The work was difficult but fulfilling, allowing me to transform my own trauma into a source of strength and guidance for others facing similar battles. The anonymous tipster who had provided the information about the surveillance cameras never revealed their identity, but I suspected it was someone within Hartwell Associates who had witnessed Marcus's behavior and finally found the courage to take action when they saw me being destroyed for telling the truth. Whoever they were, their decision to come forward had not only saved my case but had exposed a culture of abuse that might have continued indefinitely without intervention. The impact of the case extended far beyond the specific convictions, inspiring legislative changes that strengthened protections for workplace sexual assault victims and increased penalties for organizations that retaliate against employees who report abuse. The cultural shift was perhaps even more significant than the legal changes, with the business community finally beginning to acknowledge that protecting predators was not just morally wrong but also legally and financially dangerous. Today, 5 years after that terrible Valentine's Day night that changed my life forever, I can honestly say that seeking justice was the most difficult and most important thing I have ever done. The cost was enormous: my career, my reputation, my sense of safety and security. But the alternative would have been living with the knowledge that my silence had enabled Marcus to continue victimizing other women while his enablers continued to profit from a culture of abuse and impunity. The CCTV footage that proved my allegations were true became a symbol of how technology could finally provide the evidence needed to hold powerful predators accountable for crimes that had historically been impossible to prosecute. The cameras that Marcus had installed to monitor and control his employees ultimately became the instruments of his destruction, capturing truth in ways that no amount of victim blaming or character assassination could overcome. The women who came forward after my case proved that speaking truth to power, despite the personal cost, could inspire others to find their own courage and seek their own justice. Our collective voices created a chorus that could not be dismissed or discredited, forcing a reckoning with decades of abuse that had been normalized and protected by institutional power. The label of crazy that had once threatened to destroy my credibility became a badge of honor, representing the willingness to challenge powerful predators even when the entire system seemed designed to protect them and destroy their victims. Sometimes being called crazy is simply the price of refusing to accept unacceptable behavior from people who believe their power makes them untouchable. Looking back now, I realize that my story isn't unique. It's happening in offices, courtrooms, and communities across the country every single day. The difference was that anonymous tip that led to evidence no one could deny, and the courage it took to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. That CCTV footage didn't just prove what happened to me. It proved that truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it beneath lies and intimidation. The most beautiful part of this journey has been discovering that when you share your truth, even the darkest parts, you create space for others to share theirs too. Every person who listened to my story without judgment, who believed me before there was proof, who supported me through the hardest moments, they became part of something larger than any one case or conviction. If you've walked this entire path with me, from that first hopeful day at Hartwell Associates to watching justice finally served, then you already understand why stories like these matter. They remind us that survival is possible, that speaking up can make a difference, and that sometimes the most unlikely evidence can change everything. I'd love for you to be part of this community where these important stories get told, because your support makes it possible to keep sharing voices that might otherwise be silenced. Leave a comment saying, "The truth always finds a way." If you stayed until the very end, knowing you were here with me through every chapter means everything. If this story touched something in you, hitting that like button helps ensure these conversations reach people who need to hear them most. There's something powerful about connecting over shared experiences, even difficult ones, and your engagement creates that bridge. Speaking of truth finding its way to the surface, the next story will take you somewhere completely unexpected, where a woman's routine investigation into her missing inheritance uncovered family secrets that had been buried for 3 generations.